Welcome back to another episode of the Storybound podcast. I'm Charlie, your host. And today we have Bert Lechner on the podcast, and he is here today to discuss with us the intersection of neurodivergence, mental health, and creativity, as always. And I'm very excited to speak with him. Bert, can you introduce yourself to the listeners? Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your creative world.
Yeah, sure thing. Hello, my name is Bert. I am a late diagnosed autistic author from Bay Area, California. I'm a multi-genre author with publishing a little bit of cosmic horror and recently some poetry. I was diagnosed with autism about 4 years ago, and I started my writing career about 2 years ago.
How old were you when you got diagnosed, if you don't mind sharing?
I was 29. It started out with a self-diagnosis. Resources weren't very good when 4 years ago even. And I only realized that I might be autistic when I went to see Hannah Gadsby doing her comedy show, and she talked about being autistic, and I resonated with that. So I took self-tests, got a self-diagnosis first, and then got an official diagnosis about a year or so later.
Yeah, I think a lot of us who are late diagnosed kind of start that way. We see a piece of media and we're like, huh, alarm bells go off a little bit. And I know I did the same. I went and I took, what was it, the RADS R? It's one of the diagnostic tests. I took one of those tests and it put me in that category. I was like, there might be something here. So I went and saw a doctor. Did you So when you got officially diagnosed, did that change anything for you? Did you have any feelings around that?
I think the big thing was having an official diagnosis, for me at least, was something to hold on to justify calling myself autistic at first. I think as somebody who grew up being assumed to be neurotypical, even if they were weird and quiet and socially anxious, I think there can be a bit of I want to say, a guilt in associating yourself with having a disability. You don't want to encroach in that space necessarily, even if you do genuinely belong there. So having an official diagnosis was nice, for me at least, even though that's not necessary at all to say you are autistic. Self-diagnosis is absolutely valid. I have, on several occasions, doubted myself being autistic, and I will go back to that official diagnosis paper that I got just to affirm to myself that yes, I am neurodivergent and I do belong here.
I understand that. I definitely understand not wanting to encroach on that space because when I started at the same place with the self-diagnosis and I had been yelling for help from everyone who would listen, friends, family, psychiatrists, for years, right? Because I hit burnout and it was like nothing could help me. No one was helping me. I even had people asking me, like, Morgan, what do you need? We don't know how to help you, like friends and family. I was like, I don't know. I don't even know how to help myself. But I knew I was struggling and I knew I couldn't handle life anymore. And so after my divorce, I was trying to like really pick up the pieces of everything. And I was like, I think I would do better with a therapist who specializes in neurodivergence. And my boyfriend was like, why don't you schedule an appointment with a therapist that deals in neurodivergence? It was like, I'm only self-diagnosed. Like, I don't feel comfortable like taking up that space that somebody else who has been diagnosed needs. That doesn't feel right to me. And I was like reading some really mixed bag stuff on like Reddit about like self-diagnosis that was like, and Reddit's not the nicest place in the world at all. I think I actually commented on your post the other day about
Oh yeah,
that.
no, I had a fun experience with that too. So yeah, I
um,
I don't know if I would listen to Reddit in regards to deciding whether or not you are in the spectrum or not.
I know, oh, definitely. But I was just like, I was seeing stuff on Reddit about people like like self diagnosis is like not enough to be like taking resources from people who are. And I just it felt icky to me. And I was like, but I didn't want to be viewed that way. And anyways, I understand not wanting to encroach upon that space. And I also understand going back to your diagnosis. I look at mine every couple of weeks because it almost feels like I'm 35. Like it feels almost not real. I'm like, how did I go my whole life with nobody noticing this?
Yeah, I know when I got my diagnosis, and my mother, who's in her 60s, ended up going and also got diagnosed on the spectrum. So it, especially people who were born last century, which I know is a scary thing to hear for people who were born last century. Yeah, there was no awareness of the spectrum back then. And I know one of my cousins is also on the spectrum, and they were a more heavy support needed individual at the time. And so that's all I knew about autism, was the side that needed more support, as the DSM-5 categorizes. So I wasn't aware that I don't think anybody was really aware that there was a spectrum of
No.
different people.
Yeah. So I feel like even when I was growing up, the my image of autism growing up was like predominantly it was boys who were being diagnosed and they were extremely like oppositional most of the time. And so like my own view of autism has changed the older I've gotten and the more research I've done. And so yeah, I don't blame like our parents at all for not knowing. I don't blame them for that at all. But I do think we had a very narrow view of our parents and even us had a very narrow view of what that meant and what that looked like.
Yeah,
Because I don't know, but it still boggles my mind that so many of us are getting late diagnosed and that these things were never, it was never noticed before. And I don't know if it was never noticed or if a lot of us were being misdiagnosed because I was diagnosed with
yeah,
depression, anxiety, and all of this stuff. And now that I have my diagnosis, I know that the lows that I feel aren't really depression. They're like low ADHD days. Like my my brain chemistry is being weird from my ADHD.
yeah,
And I know that my anxiety is like social stuff from my autism. So it's not quite the same,
yeah,
you
exactly.
know? Anywho, I want to jump into like your autism. And you were telling me that you wrote a book. It was in healing after you were diagnosed. Do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Uh,
Tell us what's the name of the book, where's it at, and the story
yeah,
behind it.
yeah. So my most recently published book, I published it last week. In fact, it's a poetry collection titled "A Broken Vase Envenomed." It was So, in addition to being diagnosed with autism at that point in 2020, I had also just escaped a 9-year long abusive relationship where I was abused for, or emotionally abused for, quite a few of the traits that I didn't at the time realize were autistic. Yeah, relatively consistent criticism for being very structurally oriented or having a hard time changing plans, berated for how I did things differently, or if I didn't do them because of executive function, having a lot of different things that are hard to talk about. So I'll move on from that bit. But the poetry collection I wrote initially was for my own healing process. Just at the time, it was the only words I could get onto paper. I knew I had to write about my experience, but writing it in prose was just too much. So it ended up coming out as poetry. And after I wrote all of this poetry, I thought it would probably help other people to read it. So, read about the challenges of conflicting emotions during your healing process, and especially as an autistic person, not being able to identify those, and also having these very structured feelings of needing to know why things happened, having trouble with uncertainty, feeling extremely isolated, but eventually at the end having the self-awareness to find hope and find answers and push through. So the poetry collection is it's about what I experienced as an autistic domestic violence survivor, but it's also about the fact that there is hope and the chance to thrive after that.
I love that so much. I want to thank you for sharing that because I can definitely tell it was challenging to get into that a little bit, but I think you're not alone in what you've experienced at all.
Yeah, I think one of the reviewers put it really well that there really it is probably more common than we know for people on the spectrum to end up in abusive relationships, regardless of the play of genders or the play of sexuality or the play of racial roles. I know that it was me being misdiagnosed or non-diagnosed autistic before that relationship put me in a very vulnerable place to be picked by that abusive person. I know as my masking response, which kind of is, I think we end up masking two fear responses, if that makes sense. Some of us mask with fighting, some with flight, some with freezing and fawning. And I know I've to cope with my inability to understand the world, I fell into a fawning practice, and that made me really vulnerable to people who wanted to take advantage of me, like my abuser did, or who saw somebody different than who I actually was because I was masking. So, yeah, I think the abuse of neurodivergent people is just not talked about enough. And so that was another thing that compelled me to release my poetry collection, because we don't there are there's not a lot of male abuse victim voices. There's not a lot of autistic abuse voices or survivor voices. So
I agree with you.
that needed to be added there.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I do think that people who are neurodivergent, and I'm not just saying like autistic, but any type of neurodivergence, right? Like Tourette's is even considered neurodivergence. There's all sorts of different disorders that are on that spectrum of neurodivergence. I do feel like we are a very vulnerable population. Even though the relationship that I most recently exited was not abusive, it was generally a healthy relationship. The two prior relationships for that, for me, were both abusive. And now that I have hindsight, right, and I have my diagnosis, I can see how my traits were part of the reason that I
Yeah,
was, because I feel like part of my inability to navigate social situations makes me very naive sometimes, and
yeah, I
it
think
makes
that
me overly trusting.
yeah that was definitely something I would add. Yeah, it is. I know I am very trusting and naive of people as well. Just yeah, because yeah, we can't catch the cues always. We need somebody to lead us often. So
Very true.
yeah,
Very true. Yeah, so I think you're right, and I do think that your voice is needed, and I'm proud of you. Writing a book, period, is a big deal, right? And then
yeah,
having the bravery to put that out in the world for people to see and to perceive you through, like that. That's one of the reasons I haven't even published yet, is because I'm so scared to be perceived. Like even getting like beta feedback is I want to go hide in a closet.
yeah.
So you're
It's
very brave for doing that.
it is really hard, and I know like this one goes out to you and all of the neurodivergent writers and authors out there. It is, I know we are all very often rejection sensitive because it's something that has quite frequently punctuated our childhoods and our adulthoods, where we don't understand what's happening. And so when we're trying to get something out there, or yeah, I know this happened for me when I was starting to get ready to publish. I had zero idea about reception. Like there's no way for me to tell if people were enjoying what I was putting out or ignoring it or
Mm,
not seeing it at all or disliking it and not wanting to tell me. And that's, I think, especially as neurodivergent people who have a tendency to just need some sort of structure and consistency and knowledge of the world around us just to feel stable, that can be difficult.
I agree.
So
It's probably one of the things I've leaned into most since getting my diagnosis is like routine,
yeah.
right? Like routine makes me feel really stable. It makes my mood really stable. I have a lot less meltdowns if my routine is the same day in and day out. Disruptions to that definitely cause meltdowns. But I would also say, like, for me, because I'm ADHD, I crave routine, but I also have a really hard time of getting into routine. And after a week of routine, I start to get bored. Like my ADHD it needs novelty and needs something fun and like different and all of that. It's a really hard balance.
Oh yeah. No, I empathize with that so much. Yeah, I think I get a little bit of that too. I think for me, and especially a huge challenge for me as an author is just the neurodivergent executive function challenges, where you can want to do something quite considerably. You really want to do the thing, but your body is going and turning on the video game and going to get a snack when your head is screaming to go do the thing you want to do.
Yeah,
And I think that's a huge challenge overall.
I agree. I agree. The last 2 days, I've felt that. Like, I need to write. I want to write. I want to do the thing. And my brain is just,
Yeah.
nope. Like, the idea of, like, even opening up my writing laptop is just, it's like insurmountable. Like, the hill I have to climb to get there sometimes is crazy. So, like, how do you handle that? Like, in your creative process? Like,
Oh,
how do you get anything done?
the normal answer is you don't. You just you have to be kind to yourself and go, yes, this is not me being lazy. This is not weaponized incompetence. This is not something bad. This is how my brain works. We're acknowledging it. We know what we did. Let's try again tomorrow. Same time, same place. It's okay if we fail again, but it's just I do quite often I'll try to keep myself on track by like giving myself very small manageable goals. So generally I'll try to write like 200 to 500 words every day. It doesn't matter if it's for the story I'm working on. It's just practicing getting those tangled Christmas light thoughts out of my head and stringing them up on paper.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
I love it. But yeah, so there's so many different things you could do, and I've heard from so many different creatives like the way that they juggle it. I used to have a goal for myself, like that 400, 500 word like goal, and I have found for me in particular that like word goals aren't really helpful. Like they feel because I don't know if you have this because every autistic experience is not the same. Every ADHD experience is not the same. But I also have like demand avoidance. Like if I feel like I have to do something, I don't want to do it. Like I avoid it at all costs. And so like a word count goal feels like a demand. It feels. And so I focus more on like just process, like making sure I'm working on writing in some way every day, whether it is editing my book or writing some words or writing my blog or working on my podcast, because it's all intertwined. So I
Yeah.
feel like if I'm putting my hands into something every day, that's also part of routine, right? Like keeping my hand in it every day to build that routine and keep that routine, because that keeps me sane. But I'm glad to see that you've found something that works. I think that's really important. We're all
I think
different.
it's yeah, it's really normal, I think, for people on the spectrum to have a rejection of authority and a sense of don't tell me what to do. And unfortunately, that also applies to yourself. You're the
It
authority.
does.
So don't
It
tell me what to
does.
do to yourself. That it's
It's a part of the reason why it's like some days you're like, oh, I need to write. And it's like the other half of your brain is like, who are you to tell me what to do?
yeah. So it can be it is very challenging. And I think, yeah, to reiterate, it's just you've just got to be kind to yourself and just try your best not to compare yourself to the neurotypical people who are like knocking out a book in a month or doing all the staying on track, which is just impossible for me to comprehend. Staying on track of anything. Yeah, you've got to be kind to yourself and let yourself go at your own pace. You will get there. And yeah, don't give up and be kind. I think those are like the two big things to just stick around to.
I agree with you. I talk a lot on this podcast about grace, giving yourself grace. There's my cat. She likes to parkour up here. Anyways, and I also wrote like a social media post about this on Threads. I think it was just yesterday about how I'm trying to make peace with myself and like you're saying, be kind, right? I'm trying to be kind to myself and make peace with the fact that I will never be able to consistently make content the way that other people do because I do everything in bursts and big bursts. So I may post on TikTok and Threads and Instagram 3 times in one day, all 3 platforms in one day, and I'll do it again the next day. And then you won't hear from me for 4 days.
Yeah.
And that's why my podcast is set up the way it is to release an episode every other week to give me enough time to ride those waves, right? Like I may have a podcast scheduled for conversation with somebody, but that doesn't mean that I had the energy to go and edit it for a release next week. So that's why I have these really long, these bi-weekly podcasts because I'm beginning to learn to honor the way that my creativity works. It is not linear in any sort of way.
Yeah, I think that's really good that you've figured that out about your creative process. It's hard to figure out the creative process. That's awesome.
Have you found any like nuggets of your creative process? If there's any ebbs and flows to it and what makes it ebb and flow?
I'm still working on that. Yeah, I don't I talk a lot about being kind and like giving ourselves grace, but I don't tend to give myself that. I'm still that's still something I hang on to, just that sort of I I have 2 books published now, and it's just there is that thought in me, this is not enough. This is what I want to be doing. I want to get it all out now. I want to be living off of my writing. And there's that feedback loop that sort of that hits you with anxiety, whereas you've got the anxiety fuel that's getting injected into this ever quickening circle of patterns that just ends up with killing the creative process. So that is something I struggle with currently, and am trying to be geeky about it, to doomslayer my way out of, rip and tear through the anxiety, just because that's on my mind, not the writing, but everything else. So it can be very hard to undo that anxiety cycle.
I think you had mentioned this, you touched on it earlier when you're talking about being kind to ourselves, is that we can't always compare ourselves to our like neurotypical peers, right?
Yeah.
Like and it's I feel and I don't know if this adds to your anxiety at all because it does for me. But social media is a huge contributor to that anxiety and that feeling of I'm not doing enough. Do you
Oh
feel
yeah.
that way?
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. It is, yeah, social media is definitely very difficult to work with, and I wish it wasn't so essential. I wish I could be a reclusive author just like scribbling my preferred genre of cosmic horror just like in pages and distributing the books secretly and having them show up on random book on random.
Long gone are the days
Yeah.
of getting drunk out in the woods and writing your little books. Because I think it
Yeah.
was like Dickens. He like sold like a chapter at a time.
Yeah. It is frustrating and anxiety inducing that like the introverted career that I wanted to have is relying on being social in a social construct that I am observing from the outside, you know.
Yeah, I get that. I get that.
Yeah.
I've had to like I talked about this in another podcast, but I have gone like in order to protect my anxiety and protect my mental health and protect myself from the comparison game, I've gone as far as like unfollowing people. And not that there's anything wrong with those people, right? Like I support everyone in this journey who are authors and but there are some people that the comparison game got to me so much that it was like I had to wish them the best of luck in my head and unfollow for the sake of my mental health.
Yeah. No, yeah, I can empathize with that. I think it's really easy to fall into frustration and jealousy over those people just simply because of our own fears of success or failure. And that's something that, yeah, definitely requires sometimes just not engaging with it and just until you're feeling more confident and that fear is under control enough that you're not risking anger and other emotions just like catching you off guard.
You're very right. You're very right. I never thought about it being fear, but I think you might have something there that a lot of that, those feelings of like jealousy and envy are more than likely rooted in fear, right? Fear that we're not good enough, fear that, especially because we're neurodivergent, right? That no one's going to know what we do or what we write or things like that. I never thought about it in that way. So I think,
I can't claim to own that concept. I did learn it from Yoda at a very young age. I don't know. The fear leads to anger, to hate, to suffering has stuck with me. And I know it's a sci-fi movie and all that, but it is, I think, looking through it, I think a lot of anger and hate and negative emotions are fueled by fear.
don't discount it because it's sci fi, right? Like the
Well,
greatest stories in the world, we love them because they teach us something about the human experience,
that
right?
is
Like the
that is
greatest
very
stories of
true.
all time.
That is very true.
Yeah. So I
But
definitely think there's value there.
yeah,
Oh,
gotta listen to Yoda.
I
He knows
agree.
his stuff, I think.
All right. All right. So Yoda keeps you inspired or at least motivated, it sounds like. So what
Well,
keeps you going?
what keeps me going is a specially blended cocktail of passion for telling stories, excitement for the vibes that I get when I'm writing my horror, and pure spite.
I
You
love your honesty.
like one of when I went to school not for writing. I'm not one of those people who at the age of 6 or 7 was saying I want to be a writer. I hated my English classes all the way through middle school, high school. I pretty much failed my Greek mythology course in university and only got out of it because I wrote the most unhinged science fiction story about the Greek gods I could think of for extra
Oh,
credit.
wow.
So the need to write only really hit me after university, and I promise the story is going somewhere. It
I trust you.
Yeah, the need to write and the desire to become an author arrived after university when I guess part of it was writing science fiction and going, hey, I'm actually okay at this. I could try more of this. And then That's where the spite comes in, because at the time I was with my abuser and I expressed how interested I was in being an author. And they, to put it kindly, were not interested in humoring that passion. Pretty much, they were very dismissive of the desire to write. They focused on not the passion, but focused on how lucky you have to be in order to make it as an author. They focused on how much work, just doing whatever they could basically to be discouraging about pursuing a career in writing and effectively saying, this is just a hobby for you, go get a real job. And I took that personally. So after I escaped from them, I knew that I wanted to be an author. I still wanted to be an author. And I wasn't going to let anybody tell me that I couldn't do that. Fueled by spite and my passion for horror and my interest in writing, I wrote my first book, and we're here now.
I'm glad you kept writing, Bert. I'm glad you kept writing. Where would any of us be, us creatives, if we listened to all the naysayers, right? And all the people who like didn't believe in us? Because it makes me think of even like my parents never supported my creative dreams, but it's like they're like, oh, you'll never make any money doing that, or
Yeah.
whatever. It's maybe not. Maybe I'll never make money from it, but I've written 3 books. How many people could say they've written 3 books?
Yeah, not a lot.
Yeah, and I may not be published, but that's a big freaking deal. And so I'm glad you kept writing. I think spite is a totally valid reason to keep going. Sometimes that's all we have is our spite.
Yeah. Sometimes you just got to look at all of the awful things that the earth is throwing at you and just throw it right back at it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree. Give it all you got, throw your whole heart into it, show them what you're made of.
Yeah. When life gives you lemons, burn life's house down, as a very wise man once said.
Okay. Spread the whole thing down.
Don't do that. I'm not advising arson as an official author statement, but
I'm glad. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'd like to ask though, I feel like this may be part of your self care though. So, writing in spite is obviously one way that keeps you like motivated, right? And keeps you going. But what are you doing to take care of you during all of this? Obviously, sometimes writing with spite is a way that we are taking care of ourselves, taking care of our mental health, burning down the whole building. But what are other ways you are doing that?
well, for me at least, the spite was what got me actually publishing my work. Since then, I haven't had that fueling me. Now that I am actually in the thick of it, I think it is very much a matter of like deep end of the pool. Once you're in there, it's easier to keep going. Yeah. I do spend a lot of time with self-care and sort of the practice of meditating, spending time with my cats. For me, at least, cooking and baking are special interests. And so those bring me a lot of satisfaction when they work out, and that can be self care. Um, Video games are a big sort of thing I enjoy, horror movies. And then occasionally, yeah, there is writing just for the fun of it. Like I write for my Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and sometimes you just need to, I don't know where that sentence was going, but self-care is definitely very important, and there's a lot of ways I practice it in between writing.
Are you a dungeon master?
A D&D dungeon master, yeah.
Yeah, are you a dungeon master? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool. I've wanted to find a D&D group, and I have yet to find one to join. I keep looking in my local area, and I'm going to keep looking.
I think especially as somebody who writes, like getting to create my own homebrew D&D campaign has been a really helpful exercise in just improv and just letting words flow. And I think it helps a little bit with writing. And then sometimes while I'm running D&D games, I'll come up with an idea that sounds actually like good to turn into another writing project. At least a handful of things from some of my D&D games have ended up in some of my cosmic horror writing.
That's so awesome. That's
So
so awesome. And it's so nice when you have like different things that kind of fuel your fire. I think that's important, especially because it's writing, like, I don't want to say just writing, but I feel like a lot of the arts are full of rejection, right? And
yeah,
so I think it's important that we have a lot of things fueling our fire and filling our hearts and filling our cups and making us feel good. That is all part of self care. And then when they feed into other parts of our lives in terms of like story ideas, like that's wonderful. I get story ideas from like music, and I might read one little nugget in a book and be like, oh, that's a really cool idea, and take that
yeah,
and turn it into something bigger. So it's nice when those things feed into the other parts of our lives.
yeah. I think especially as neurodivergent people, we are very passionate often about our interests, and it is really important to let ourselves be passionate about those interests.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And Mel, we're all like, I've heard the word, I don't know if you've heard this word before, but we're often like monotrop. I don't know if you've
Yeah,
heard that before.
yeah. I think being very single-minded about like specific tasks and interests.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that in my life, right?
Yeah,
And it makes me wonder about all the people who haven't had that ability to do that. Like, what happens to autistic people? And this is totally off topic and not part of the podcast. Like, this is just me theorizing a thought that I have is what happens to all the autistic people who are not allowed to participate in
yeah,
tropism? So,
yeah,
like for me, my whole life like revolves around writing. Like I've written 3 books. I have a writing group that I'm in and out of every day. I have a podcast that revolves around not just writing, but like creativity in general
yeah.
and all of that stuff. So it's like my whole world revolves around like my creative interests. So I wonder what happens.
No,
There
that's
has
good.
to be negative effects.
If there's negative, I don't know if saying monotropism should be considered negative at all. I think that's how
No,
our
I'm not
brains
saying that. I'm
operate.
saying if like someone who's autistic, because our brains are monotropic, if they're not allowed to participate in being
Oh, yeah,
monotropic because of, for example, we're all masking, right? And because of masking, because of like the way we have to move through the world, it
yeah,
often doesn't allow for being monotropic. And so I'm just wondering, is
yeah.
I wonder if there's negative effects from that.
Okay. Yeah, I understand you now. Yeah. I do think, yeah, unfortunately, it does feel like there's still that stigma around in our typical society of people who have a single-minded focus on singular interests. I know I've, because autistic people are also very good mimics, I have fallen into sort of that trap of being critical towards monotropic people too. I know we talk about Swifties and Potterheads quite negatively in the social context as people who are far too focused on a singular thing and quote unquote make that their personality. And that's, I think that's something we need to stop criticizing people for. Because if your special interest is the office, then your special interest is the office, and you should be able to just find the groups that are also having their special interest be the office without having to face any sort of criticism or mocking or that sort of thing. Because young, non-diagnosed autistic people are going to see people mocking those who have singular interests and go, "Oh, that's a bad thing. I'm going to repress that." And then I think that will that leads to what you're thinking about, what sort of negative effects avoiding your monotropism might have, which I think is probably things like depression and anxiety and additional social strife.
I agree. I do think it starts like on that bigger kind of community level of or cultural level, I suppose, of the way that we are looking at everything and the way that we look at autism, and even just simple things like people being super interested in one particular topic, like the way that we talk about those things online and in person within our friend groups has a larger impact, right?
Yeah.
And I do agree. I think it starts there. Like we definitely need to be critical of ourselves because I know as someone who's late diagnosed, I'm still dealing with a lot of my own internal ableism and like trying to work through that. That's not something that you just get over, especially as I learn more about my own disability and how like rampant it is within my own life. I do think it starts on that larger cultural thing or
Yeah.
community level within our own little communities. Cause like me and you could be the start of that change. If we see someone talking negatively in a way, like we can speak up towards that. So I do think it starts within our own little communities.
Yeah, I think so.
But bringing that up, do you have community? Obviously, you're a DM, so you have to have community of some kind, right? And how important is that to you in your creative process?
Uh, yeah, I'm very blessed with the amount of different special interest groups I'm part of. I have amazing friends I play Dungeons and Dragons with. My family is incredibly supportive of my writing career, and they're just amazing with that. I have places I can engage with people for horror, and I have writers groups I join, and just, yeah, it's the best way to put it. I'm not sure what the best way to put it is, but yeah,
No,
I am very blessed with a large net of friends and groups that I can engage my special interests and fuel my creativity with.
okay, and that's what I was going to ask. Do you feel like it makes an impact on your overall creative journey, that it helps you be a more creative person?
Yeah, I think the biggest killer to creativity is anxiety. And as neurodivergent people, I think we get the lion's share of anxiety amongst people. Just and having social groups where I don't have to mask and having social groups that are aligned to my special interest where that anxiety is not there, that that clears out the air more and lets me be more creative.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'm just thinking about it in my own life. When I'm the most comfortable around certain people, it does provide more space in my life to be more of myself. And that in extension applies to my creativity. It gives me almost like a sense of confidence to be myself and to express myself that feels the most authentic to me, whether that's writing something or painting something or drawing something, whatever it is within that moment. So I can understand how that makes a big difference.
Yeah, yeah,
So moving forward for you, you obviously just released a book, like it's fresh off the
yeah,
press, right?
yeah. Fresh
What
last week.
are, yeah, it's a couple of days ago, pretty much. So what are the goals moving forward? Are you trying
Um,
to push this book for a little while? Or are you already working on the next thing?
yeah, I think I have the sort of automated marketing elements taken care of for A Broken Vase Envenomed. We're getting back into the spooky season, which means I'm probably going to be talking more about my first book more, the collection of short horror stories.
What's the name
And
of that?
that's called The Roots Grow Into the Earth. Yes, it's a pretty short collection of short cosmic horror stories, and that was the first official book I published. But as far as like future works, I've been having a hard time focusing on writing just due to general sort of anxieties and things. But I have a few front burner projects. I have what's shaping up to be a novella, which will be following up with some of the characters I did mention in my first story collection, The Roots Grow Into the Earth. I have a short story that might turn into a novelette or a novella about a cryptid that I made a couple of years ago. And then I have a third, probably short story that I'm working on that is just secret for now. I'm not going to talk much
That's
about
okay.
that. But
Okay.
yeah, I think I have no lack of ideas to put on paper. It's just a matter of, I think, as I said before, untangling the Christmas lights and actually getting it on the page.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a lot of coals in the fire. I feel very much the same. Like I have 3 books written, and each of those books could have sequels. Every single one of them, they could have
Oh,
sequels.
yeah.
And then I have and then one is like a series, like my novella that I wrote. It's won't necessarily have a sequel. They're like standalones, but within a like contained series, you know? So I have that. And then I have all these other, I have this idea for a psychological thriller. I have this idea for a sci-fi novel. I have this idea for this like epic fantasy. I'm all over the place. I have
Really?
no shortage of ideas. But I'm like you, I have a hard time. It's the focusing.
Oh, yeah.
It's the hard part. I like
It's
getting
so different.
myself to sit down to do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any sort of message or advice that you would like to share with our listeners that you haven't already shared?
I think I've pretty much covered it. I think if there's anything else I have to say for all of you neurodivergent people out there, just be yourselves. Being yourselves is like the best thing you can do for yourself. And it's hard to get there. You will find people who aren't going to like you as yourself. And then the matter is to find the people who do like you for yourself. Yeah, it's a really unstable, scary world sometimes, especially for like us who need stability. And yeah, be kind, be yourself, find the people that love you as yourself, and be awesome.
Thank you, Bert. That's really good advice. It really is. I think more of us could do, even myself could do more with being more ourselves and not being so scared of what everyone is going to think. So thank you for that reminder. So where can listeners find you though? If they want to find your books, do you have a website? Are your books on Amazon, Kobo? Where are you at?
If you want to find me on social media, first, all of my tags are author Bert S. Lechner. I'm active on Instagram and I'm unhinged on Threads. So you can find me at either of those places for books. You can find me on Amazon. You can find me on my website at bertwriteshorror.com. But if you're interested in my books, I would most prefer if you got them from bookshop.org. It's a really great website where you can pick a local independent bookstore to have your books shipped from, and they get part of the profit. So it's supporting indie bookstores and also giving you a similar convenience to Amazon. And you can get all of my books there. If you're more of a Kindle person, you can get A Broken Vase Envenomed on Kindle Unlimited. And I think that's about it. You should be able to find me pretty much everywhere.
Okay. Thank you, Bert. And I have
Thank you.
one last question for you. So, what's something our listeners might not know about you? Maybe something you haven't put on social media. It doesn't have to be anything weird, just like maybe something you don't really share all that often, like your favorite plant or something. I don't know.
I mean, that is hard because I do tend to I value vulnerability and I do try to share as much about myself as I can on social media. I don't think I've talked about my favorite mushroom though. And it is I like mushrooms a lot. They're such cute, cool little things.
I'm
And my
that's like
favorite
one of
is
my
actually
special interests.
it is yeah, mycology
I
is
learned how to grow them. I love them.
it is a yeah, but you can't go wrong with the classics, and I love the classic fly agaric, the red capped mushroom with the white spots. That's just as
Little Mario guy. That's
yeah,
what that is.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
just it's yeah. I love the fly agaric, love mushrooms. I judge video games entirely off of how many variants of mushrooms you're allowed to pick up in them. That and if they have trains. Like if you've got a video game that has a lot of different mushrooms and it has trains in it, I will buy it almost instantly.
Try. I told you before this I was playing Once Human. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, if this is going into the recording, I had a hard time getting into it, but
Oh,
it
you
doesn't.
tried it?
Yeah, I did try it. I had maybe my opinions on Once Human Are Better for a different interview.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine. I'll make one more recommendation, but trains and mushrooms Stardew.
Yes, I do. I do really like Stardew Valley a lot.
Okay. That's a comfort play for me. It's a comfort
Yeah.
play. Okay. Thank you for your time. I also want to thank our listeners for being here, for giving us your time, for listening. I do hope that you go check out Bert's books. He, again, just released a poetry book last week. Well, I guess by the time this comes out, it'll probably be a couple of weeks, but please go check it out. That would mean the world to both me and Tim. And again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, and have a good day, everyone.